In this lecture, we're going to talk about cells and their functions. So what are cells? Cells are the smallest unit of life. Cells are the building blocks of all living things. You are made of cells. And cells have quite a diversity to them. Over here we see a neuron. These are bone cells. These are skin cells. Each cell has its own shape and own set of organelles that are special to the jobs that they perform within the organism. Types of cells. So there are two main types of cells. There are eukaryotes, which are things like animals and plants and fungus and protista. Then the other category are called prokaryotes. Prokaryotes meaning the first cells. And those are all bacteria. So bacteria are prokaryotes. Everything else is going to be eukaryotic. The way to remember that is you are eukaryotic. So the differences between eukaryotes and prokaryotes. The main difference is eukaryotes have a structure called a nucleus. And a nucleus, so you can see one right here in this plant cell, here in this animal cell, right here in this fungus cell, here in this protista cell. What a nucleus is an area where the DNA is stored within the eukaryotic cell with a membrane around it. Prokaryotes have no nucleus. Instead, they have a region that's called a nucleoid, which is just where the DNA hangs out, but there's no actual membrane surrounding it. Eukaryotes have membrane-bound organelles, meaning they have organelles or little structures that have membranes around it, whereas prokaryotes do not have membrane-bound organelles. Membrane-bound organelles, an example of that would be mitochondria, chloroplasts, endoplasmic reticulum. Non-membrane-bound organelle are things like ribosomes. The DNA is also structurally different. Eukaryotes have linear DNA, which means a single line of DNA, whereas the DNA in prokaryotes are circular, so think kind of like a rubber band, a complete loop. Eukaryotes are quite a bit larger than prokaryotes, about 100 times larger. Eukaryotes can make up multicellular organisms. There's also some single-celled eukaryotes, but prokaryotes are all single-celled. So they make up bacteria, and therefore in a single-celled organism, the cell is the organism, unlike a human where we're made up of trillions of cells. So to make the organisms, we have multiple cells, or we're multi-celled. Size comparison, if you take a look here, here's our prokaryote. And here we're only seeing a small fraction of that eukaryote because eukaryotic cells are about 100 times larger than a prokaryotic cell. So how do we see these? We see cells using microscopes. In class, we use something called a compound light microscope, which has a limit of magnification about 2,000 times. So we can make the image about 2,000 times larger than it is in real life. And then the more powerful microscope, which we can't even begin to afford at our school, is electron microscope, which magnifies things 200,000 times. And it actually hits the specimen with a beam of high-powered electrons that create images. And we have two electron microscopes. We have TEM, which is transmission electron microscopes that allow you to see the inside and create these 2D images. And then we have what's called scanning electron microscopes that allow you to see the surface of the specimen and see these three-dimensional shapes. So what do all cells have in common? They're made of macromolecules. So the cells are made of the proteins, the lipids, the carbohydrates, and the nucleic acids that we just learned about. And they all possess similar structures. They all have a cell membrane, they all have DNA, and they all contain cytoplasm. So why do we study cells? Because cells are us. We are built from about 10 trillion cells, and each cell is specifically designed for the function that they're going to do within our body and have their own set of organelles and their own different shape. So here's showing some different types. So nerve cells, muscle, heart cells, intestinal cells, blood cells. So again, why do we study cells? Because cells are us, and the way that cells are organized into organisms is that cells group together to form tissues. So here's our many cells forming a tissue, and then these many cells make up our organism. And so cells make up tissue, things like skin, bone, muscle, and then those tissues make up organs, things like your heart, your liver, your lungs. And then those organs make up organ systems such as your digestive system, respiratory system, circulatory system, nervous system. And then all those systems together make up the organism. So organisms are made of cells, and the cells then do all the work of life. So what is the work of life? The work of life talk about the jobs the cells do. So cells respire, meaning they take in oxygen and they release carbon dioxide. Cells eat. Basically, when you eat your food, you break your food down into teeny tiny molecules, and then your blood actually delivers these food molecules to every cell of your body. And then your cell utilizes these molecules to release energy and transfer that energy to ATP. So I say make energy, and because the reason why I have quotation marks around energy is because you can't really make energy. What you do is you harvest energy from something else. So in the cell takes energy from food that it digests and transfers that energy to ATP. And then that energy in ATP can be used to power anabolic reactions, building molecules such as proteins, carbohydrates, fats, nucleic acids. Cells also remove waste, so when they break down food, waste is created and that has to be eliminated from the cell. Cells control the internal conditions, which we call homeostasis. So cells keep us in balance in terms of regulating our pH, regulating our temperature, regulating salt concentration, sugar concentration, you name it. Response to internal or external environment. So for example, you go outside, it's cold, your cells will stimulate to cause you to shiver. Build more cells. So if you fall and skin your knee, you have to replace those cells. Also, you're a lot bigger than you were when you were a baby, and where all that extra material comes from is from building more cells. More cells help you to grow. So we can take all this work of life and kind of break it down into three categories, or three main jobs that the cell does. The three main jobs are make energy, again, quotations because they're not really making energy, they're harvesting it from the food that they're breaking down and other exergonic reactions. Make proteins, so proteins do all the work in the cells, so we need lots of them, so the cells are actually going to make these proteins. And to make more cells for growth and to replace damaged or diseased cells. Cells actually have a lifespan. And depending on what type of cell it is, it'll have different lifespans from a few days to a few months to even years. So inside of the cell, we have smaller little structures called organelles. So all of these things that are brightly colored, by the way, in this diagram, the colors are just randomly chosen. The organelles don't really have color, with the exception of a chloroplast. But organelles, these are organelles do the work of the cell, and actually this ending E-L-L-E, L means little or small, so the word literally means little organs. So each of these are little specialized structures within the cell that do a specific job to keep the cell alive and thus keep you alive. So yes, penguin, they're like mini organs. So the first job that we're going to talk about is that cells need power, cells need energy. So again, making energy, really I should say harvesting energy. So providing energy to do the daily life functions, growth, etc. To do this, we have to take in food, digest it, which is very exergonic, releasing that energy, take in oxygen, and then transfer that energy to ATP. And then we can use that ATP to power all the synthesis reactions of the body. We also need to remove waste, so when you break down the food to release the energy, you create waste material. And the organelles that are going to do this work are going to be the cell membrane, lysosomes, vacuoles and vesicles, and mitochondria. So starting with the cell membrane, the function of the cell membrane is to separate the outside from the inside. So this is the barrier around the cell, controls what enters and leaves the cell. So some of the things that have to go back and forth across this membrane are things like oxygen, carbon dioxide, food, water, nutrients, waste. Another function is for cell communication. So the membrane actually receives signals from other cells that will tell the cell what to do. The structure of the membrane is that it's made of a double layer of fat, a specific fat called a phospholipid, and it forms a phospholipid bilayer. And so you can see here each of the heads and tails. So here's one layer of the phospholipid bilayer, here's the other. Each phospholipid has a phosphate head, which is hydrophilic, and a lipid tail, which is hydrophobic, which we learned about when we talked about lipids. And because of this, they're going to arrange themselves in a specific way with all of the hydrophilic phosphate heads pointing out and all the hydrophobic fat tails pointing in. And we get this lipid bilayer. So also in our membrane we have receptor molecules which will pick up signals from other cells, so proteins that are given off, or in some cases steroid. So to label this, pull out your diagram. And here, all outlined in red, that is our cell membrane. It's the cell boundary, controls the movement of materials in and out of cell, and recognizes cell signal. The other thing to label is what's called the cytoplasm. It's the jelly-like material holding all the organelles in place. So all of this in kind of tan is supposed to represent our cytoplasm. So vacuoles and vesicles, if we take a look at them, the function of them are moving materials around the cell and for storage. Vesicles specifically are for removing materials, and the vacuoles are for storage. So if we take a look here, here's a little food particle, and what happens is the cell membrane pinches inward to form a vesicle. So vesicle is actually made of membrane, and that membrane could come from the cell membrane itself. So forming a vesicle. And the structure of vesicles and vacuoles is that they're just a membrane sac. They're actually, if you take a look at this, we've cut the vesicle in half. It would actually be a complete sphere. We're seeing a cross section here. So the vacuole is filled with digestive enzymes that will help break down the food into smaller and smaller molecules. Vesicles are filled with digested nutrients that will either be used by the mitochondria to make ATP. Some of this will be waste, which will eventually be expelled from the cell, but this vesicle actually helps to make the molecules even smaller. There are lots of different types of vacuoles. So vacuoles are for storage. So there are food vacuoles in animal cells that'll store food. There's contractile vacuoles in organisms called paramecia that actually pump water out of the cell. And then plants have a really large vacuole called a central vacuole that holds water, and this is also what gives the plant cell its stiffness. And when you see a plant wilting, it's because the water has been lost from its vacuole. So here are vesicles and vacuoles. Vesicles transport materials within the cell, and vacuole stores them as long as the cell will need it. Lysosomes are very similar to a vesicle, but they're a special type of vesicle that help us digest food and also clean up and recycle materials within the cell. So if an organelle stops functioning, a lysosome actually can break up that broken organelle and break it back into its individual molecules, back into its carbs, its lipids, its proteins, etc. The structure of them is just a membrane sac. Really, it's a vesicle with digestive enzymes in it. So if we look at this pathway again, here's our small food particle coming in, the food particle in its vacuole being stored. Here is a lysosome, which is being made by something up here called the Golgi. And so the little purple dots represent enzymes that are going to break up the food. So what will happen is this vacuole and this lysosome will fuse together into one large structure, and the enzymes from the lysosome will break up the food. So here's the digested food inside. Here is a mitochondria that stopped working, and you can see the lysosome actually engulfs that mitochondria and is breaking it down back into its individual molecules. So another job of a lysosome is really important. You would not have fingers without lysosomes. So early on in development, you actually have hands like a paddle. There's no separation between the digits in your fingers. What the lysosomes do is they actually digest the cells in between each of those fingers, creating the separate digits. This also happens with your toes. So sometimes the lysosomes don't work properly in development, and so you end up with fingers, digits that are fused together, which is easily corrected with surgery. So here's the lysosome here on your cell diagram. Lysosomes are for food digestion and garbage disposal and recycling. Lysosomes look very similar to a vesicle, it's just filled with enzyme. Please watch part 2.